Blood dripped onto the quarterly report during slide 17. Ilara Monroe had perfected the art of invisible suffering. 3 days of concealing bruises beneath blazers, foundation thick enough to hide fingerprints on her throat, and movements calculated to avoid drawing attention to the ribs that screamed every time she breathed. But bodies have limits, even when minds refuse to acknowledge them. The boardroom of DeLuca Enterprises occupied the 42nd floor, floor-to-ceiling windows framing Silvercrest City like a kingdom laid out for inspection. 12 executives sat around imported mahogany, discussing logistics chains and profit margins while the woman presenting their numbers fought to remain conscious. Roman DeLuca didn't participate in these meetings so much as preside over them. He occupied the head of the table the way predators occupy territory, absolutely, without question. People called him a legitimate businessman to his face. Behind closed doors, they whispered about the empire that operated in shadows, the network that made problems disappear, the reputation built on loyalty rewarded and betrayal punished. His eyes had been on Ilara since she'd entered the room that morning. Not obviously. Roman DeLuca wasn't obvious about anything. But she felt the weight of his attention like pressure against her skin, tracking her slight hesitation before sitting, the way she gripped the presentation remote too tightly, the calculated breath she took before speaking. If you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next changes everything. The room tilted during her third slide. Ilara's vision narrowed to a pinpoint, the voices around her distorting into underwater echoes. Her body made the decision her mind had been denying for 72 hours. She collapsed. Not gracefully. Not cinematically. Her knees simply stopped supporting her weight, and she dropped like a puppet with cut strings, the remote clattering against polished wood, her shoulder striking the edge of the table before she hit the floor. Chaos erupted immediately. Executives pushed back chairs, voices overlapping in concern and confusion. Someone shouted about calling an ambulance. Another demanded space, air, water. Roman moved differently. He was out of his chair and across the room before her body finished falling, catching her with a precision that suggested he'd anticipated the collapse. His hands were careful, professional, supporting her weight as he lowered her the rest of the way to the carpet. That's when he saw them. Her blazer had twisted during the fall, pulling away from her collar. The concealer she'd applied that morning had cracked along her jawline, revealing the edge of a bruise that disappeared beneath her shirt. But it wasn't the bruise on her jaw that made Roman's expression go flat and dangerous. It was the perfect impression of fingers around her throat. His voice cut through the panic like a blade through silk. Everyone out. The executives froze. Now. They moved. Roman DeLuca had built his empire on the principle that control was everything. Lose control, lose power. Lose power, lose everything that mattered. He'd maintained that control through wars, federal investigations, betrayals that would have destroyed lesser men. But watching executives scramble toward the exit while Ilara Monroe lay unconscious at his feet, something in that carefully constructed control shifted. The room emptied in 47 seconds. His head of security appeared in the doorway, read the situation in a glance, and positioned himself outside without being asked. The door clicked shut, sealing them in silence broken only by Ilara's shallow breathing. Roman knelt beside her, his movements efficient but not rough. Years of navigating dangerous situations had taught him how to assess threats, read injuries, determine whether someone was faking or genuine. Everything about this woman's collapse screamed genuine. Up close, the evidence was worse. Foundation creased along her cheekbone revealed mottled purple underneath. The bruising around her throat formed a pattern he'd seen before, not accidental, not self-inflicted. Someone had choked her hard enough to leave marks that 3 days hadn't faded. Her breathing was too shallow, suggesting damaged ribs. When he carefully straightened her blazer, he caught the slight bulge of improper bandaging beneath her shirt. She'd been hiding this. Coming to work every day, presenting to boardrooms, maintaining the facade of competence while her body screamed for help. The question wasn't what happened. That was obvious. The question was who, when, and why she hadn't reported it. Ilara's eyes fluttered open. Confusion first, then awareness, then something worse than fear, resignation. Like she'd expected this moment, expected to be caught, expected consequences. Don't move. Roman's voice was quieter than it had been 30 seconds ago, but no less commanding. You're hurt. She tried to sit up anyway. Pain lanced across her face, stealing her breath. Roman's hand on her shoulder was gentle but immovable. I said don't move. I can explain. Her voice came out hoarse, damaged. You'll explain everything. But not here. He pulled his phone from his pocket, typed a quick message. I'm taking you somewhere safe. My private residence. Medical assistance is already on the way. Terror flickered in her eyes. Not of him, he realized. Of something else entirely. Please, I'll be fine, I can go home. Ilara. Her name in his mouth stopped her mid-sentence. Look at me. She did. Those eyes, intelligent, resilient, currently drowning in fear, met his. Whoever did this to you doesn't get another opportunity. You understand? This ends today. Something in his tone must have reached through her panic. She stopped trying to sit up, stopped trying to deflect. Her next words came out barely above a whisper. He'll kill me if I tell. Roman's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He'll wish he'd never been born if you don't. Roman's private residence wasn't what Ilara expected. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of the Meridian Tower, but it lacked the cold ostentation she'd imagined. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around three sides, offering panoramic views of Silvercrest City as afternoon light painted the skyline in shades of amber and gold. The furniture was expensive but comfortable, chosen for function rather than display. Books lined one wall, actual books, worn spines suggesting they'd been read rather than staged for aesthetics. He'd carried her from his private elevator to a bedroom that faced east, settling her onto a bed with sheets that probably cost more than her monthly rent. The gentleness in his movements contradicted everything she knew about Roman DeLuca. Or thought she knew. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived 17 minutes later, a woman in her 50s with efficient hands and kind eyes. She'd clearly worked with Roman before, no questions about why a collapse in a boardroom had resulted in treatment at a private residence rather than a hospital. She simply opened her medical bag and got to work. Ilara endured the examination in silence. The doctor's expression grew progressively grimmer as she catalogued damage: 3 cracked ribs, severe bruising across her torso and back, the ligature marks on her throat, defensive wounds on her forearms that Ilara had hidden beneath long sleeves. Roman stood near the window during the examination, his back to them, giving her privacy. But Ilara could see his reflection in the glass. His jaw was tight, hands clasped behind his back in a posture that looked relaxed but wasn't. Every new injury Dr. Chen documented seemed to make that reflection harder, colder. You're lucky nothing's broken, Dr. Chen said quietly, wrapping Ilara's ribs properly. But you need rest. Real rest. No work for at least 2 weeks, possibly 3. I can't. You will. Roman's voice carried from the window without him turning around. Consider it paid medical leave. Non-negotiable. Dr. Chen packed her supplies, prescribed pain medication, left instructions for wound care. She squeezed Ilara's hand before leaving. You're safe here. I promise. After she left, silence stretched between them. Ilara sat propped against pillows, properly bandaged for the first time in days, her body finally acknowledging the full scope of damage now that adrenaline had faded. Roman remained at the window, backlit by afternoon sun, waiting. Marcus Vieri, Ilara finally said. Senior Operations Manager. It happened Monday night. Roman turned. His expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes, those eyes promised violence. I filed a harassment complaint against him 3 weeks ago. HR was supposed to handle it quietly. Her laugh was bitter. He found out. Cornered me in the parking garage after everyone else had left. Said I needed to learn my place, that nobody would believe me over him, that reporting him was the biggest mistake of my life. Tell me everything. So she did. The words came easier than Ilara expected. Maybe because Roman didn't interrupt. Didn't offer empty sympathy or useless platitudes. He simply listened with the focused intensity of someone cataloging information for a specific purpose, and that purpose had nothing to do with comfort. Marcus Vieri had been untouchable for years. Senior enough to have influence, connected enough to have protection, smart enough to never leave evidence. The harassment started small, comments about her appearance during meetings, emails with subject lines that crossed professional lines, his hand lingering too long on her lower back during conference room exits. She documented everything. Timestamps, witnesses, screenshots. Built her case carefully because she knew how these things went. Women who complained without ironclad evidence became problems. Problems got eliminated. HR had promised a discreet investigation. 2 days later, Marcus cornered her in the parking garage at 9:47 p.m. on a Monday. Security cameras in that section had been malfunctioning for weeks, something she hadn't known until it was too late. He didn't say much at first. Just slammed her against a concrete pillar hard enough to crack ribs, his forearm across her throat cutting off air and sound. The message was clear: this is what happens to women who forget their place. When she tried to scream, his hand had closed around her throat. Squeezed until black spots danced across her vision, until her lungs burned, until she genuinely believed the last thing she'd see was his face twisted with rage in a poorly lit parking garage. He'd released her before she passed out. Let her collapse to the oil-stained concrete, gasping. Then he'd crouched beside her, voice conversational, and explained exactly what would happen if she pursued the complaint. She'd lose her job. Her reputation. Possibly more permanent things. I believed him, Ilara said quietly. He has photographs. From the company retreat last year. Someone drugged my drink, I'm sure of it now, though I couldn't prove it then. I woke up in my hotel room with gaps in my memory and bruises I couldn't explain. Marcus showed me photos from that night. Said he'd been protecting me by keeping them private, but if I pushed the harassment complaint, those photos would end up everywhere. Roman's silence was more terrifying than rage would have been. So I came to work, she continued. Covered the bruises, pretended everything was fine, and tried to figure out what to do. I thought if I could just get through the board meeting, present the quarterly numbers, prove I was still valuable to the company despite the complaint, maybe I'd have leverage to. She stopped. How stupid it sounded now. Like anything she could have done would have mattered against someone like Marcus Vieri. You wanted to prove you weren't a liability, Roman said. So they wouldn't have an excuse to eliminate the problem by eliminating you. Yes. He pulled out his phone, typed a message, pocketed it again. That was smart, Ilara. But unnecessary. Why? Because Marcus Vieri just became my problem, not yours. Ilara had heard stories about what happened to people who crossed Roman DeLuca. Most were whispered in break rooms or over drinks after particularly stressful workdays. Urban legends, probably. The competitor who'd tried to undercut a major deal and disappeared 3 days before the contract signing. The federal agent who'd gotten too close to something sensitive and suddenly transferred to Alaska. The business partner who'd been caught skimming funds and was never seen again, though his family received monthly payments that continued to this day. Nobody knew what was true. That was the point. Roman DeLuca's reputation existed in the space between confirmed fact and terrifying possibility, and that uncertainty made him more dangerous than certainty ever could. Watching him now, backlit by city lights as dusk settled over Silvercrest, Ilara wondered which stories were real. What are you going to do? Her voice came out steadier than she felt. What needs to be done? Roman returned to the chair beside her bed, settling into it with the casual authority of someone who owned every space he occupied. But first, I need you to understand something. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. Up close, she could see details the boardroom distance had hidden, the slight scar above his left eyebrow, the way his eyes weren't quite black but deep brown, the calculated precision in how he held himself. Marcus Vieri has been a problem for longer than 3 weeks, Roman said. This isn't the first complaint filed against him. It's the 5th. Ilara's breath caught. 5? The previous 4 were handled through HR settlements, NDAs, transfers to other departments. Standard corporate solutions that protect the company and punish the victim. His tone suggested exactly what he thought of standard corporate solutions. I wasn't aware of the pattern until recently. My fault for delegating HR oversight to people who prioritized reputation over justice. You didn't know. I should have. No deflection, no excuses. Just acceptance of responsibility. DeLuca Enterprises is my company. Everything that happens under my name is my responsibility, including failures of protection for employees who deserved better. The admission surprised her. Men with Roman's power rarely acknowledged failures, let alone accepted blame for systems they hadn't directly overseen. The other women, Ilara said carefully. Are they? safe, compensated, and as of 2 hours ago, offered positions in departments where they'll never encounter Vieri or anyone who enabled him. Roman's expression was unreadable. But compensation isn't justice. Safety after the fact isn't protection. I failed them by not recognizing the pattern sooner. Silence settled between them. Outside, the city transformed as lights blinked on across buildings, casting Silvercrest in its evening glow. Somewhere down there, Marcus Vieri was going about his life, unaware that his world had just been marked for demolition. What happens to him? Ilara asked. Roman's smile was cold and precise. He stops existing as a problem. Permanently. Ilara spent 3 days in Roman's penthouse before she realized she wasn't a guest, she was being protected. The distinction became clear in small details. Security personnel stationed discreetly in the hallway. Dr. Chen's daily visits that felt more like supervision than follow-up care. The way Roman's assistant, a sharp woman named Victoria, appeared twice daily with meals prepared by a private chef, each dish carefully calibrated for healing rather than indulgence. Roman himself maintained a careful distance. He checked on her each morning before leaving for the office, returned in the evenings to ensure she had everything needed, but never lingered. Never pushed for conversation or forced intimacy born from circumstance. He was present without being intrusive, attentive without making her feel like a burden. It was the strangest captivity she'd ever experienced. On the 4th morning, Ilara woke to find him standing at the eastern windows, coffee in hand, watching sunrise paint the city in shades of rose and gold. Still wearing yesterday's clothes, suggesting he'd been up all night. Marcus Vieri resigned yesterday, Roman said without turning around. Effective immediately. He's relocating to Seattle for personal reasons, according to the official statement. Ilara sat up carefully, her ribs protesting less than they had days ago. And the unofficial truth? He understood that remaining in Silvercrest wasn't compatible with his continued existence. Roman's tone was conversational, discussing Vieri's departure the way someone might discuss weather patterns. The photographs he claimed to have don't exist anymore. Neither does any evidence he thought gave him leverage. His finances have been restructured in ways that make litigation unappealing. And certain information about his activities has been shared with people who ensure he understands that silence is his only viable option. You destroyed him. I removed a threat. Roman finally turned to face her. There's a difference. Destruction would have been satisfying but potentially messy. Removal is clean, permanent, and leaves no possibility of retaliation against you or the other women he targeted. The morning light softened his features, making him look less like the dangerous figure from boardroom legends and more like a man who'd spent 4 nights ensuring justice for someone he barely knew. Why? Ilara asked. You could have handled this through legal channels, let corporate attorneys manage everything. Why personally involve yourself? Roman was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested the answer mattered more than the question. Because legal channels failed you 5 times. Because corporate solutions protect institutions, not people. Because watching you collapse in that boardroom, realizing you'd been walking around with cracked ribs and strangulation marks while presenting quarterly reports, he stopped, reset. Because someone should have protected you before it reached that point, and since no one did, I'm correcting the failure. By making him disappear. By ensuring he never harms anyone again. Yes. Ilara should have been frightened. Should have recognized the casual discussion of life-altering retribution as a warning about the man standing across from her. Instead, she felt safe for the first time in months. Recovery happened in layers. Physical healing came first. Dr. Chen monitored her progress with the efficiency of someone accustomed to treating injuries that couldn't be explained in emergency rooms. The ribs knitted slowly, the bruises faded from purple to yellow-green, her throat stopped aching every time she swallowed. By the end of the 2nd week, Ilara could move without wincing, breathe without pain, exist in her body without constant reminders of violence. Emotional recovery proved more complicated. She'd wake at 3 a.m. convinced she heard footsteps in the parking garage. Shadows in corners would trigger adrenaline spikes that left her shaking. The sound of male voices raised in anger, even from television shows playing in distant rooms, sent her heart racing. Trauma had rewired her nervous system, and unwiring it required patience she didn't always have. Roman noticed. Of course he noticed. The man who'd built an empire on reading people and situations wasn't going to miss the signs of hypervigilance in someone living under his roof. He adjusted without being asked. Started announcing his presence before entering rooms. Kept his voice level and quiet during their conversations. Made sure she always had clear sightlines to exits. Never touched her without explicit permission, never crowded her space, never made her feel trapped. It was consideration she hadn't expected from someone with his reputation. "You've done this before," Ilara said one evening. They'd fallen into a routine of sharing dinner in the main living area, the city sprawling below them like a kingdom of lights. Helped someone recover from trauma. Roman looked up from his meal. "What makes you say that?" "The way you move around me. Give me space but not isolation. How you never ask if I'm okay but instead ask what I need." She set down her fork. "Most people don't know how to handle someone who's been hurt. They either suffocate with concern or avoid entirely because it's uncomfortable. You do neither. I've seen enough damage to recognize recovery takes time," he said carefully. "And that everyone's timeline is different." There was history in that statement. Pain that predated their acquaintance. Ilara wanted to ask but sensed the answer lived in territory he wasn't ready to share. Instead, she changed the subject. "Victoria mentioned you're personally reviewing all HR policies across the company. Making changes. Long overdue changes." Roman's expression hardened slightly. The system that allowed Vieri to operate for years required institutional failure at multiple levels. "I'm correcting those failures." "And the women he hurt?" "Offered positions commensurate with their experience and abilities. Reporting structures that bypass anyone who was involved in suppressing their complaints. And access to resources if they need additional support." He met her eyes. "Which brings me to something I wanted to discuss with you." Ilara felt her stomach tighten. Here it was, the conversation about her returning to work, resuming her life, leaving the safety of his penthouse for reality. "I have a proposition," Roman continued. "And I need you to understand you're free to refuse without consequence." Roman stood and walked to the windows overlooking the city, hands in his pockets, silhouette framed against Silvercrest's glittering nightscape. "I've watched you for 18 months, he said. "Long before the incident with Vieri. You have a talent most people in corporate environments lack. You see patterns others miss, connections between data points that seem unrelated. Your quarterly analysis last year identified a supply chain vulnerability 3 months before our competitors exploited it. The operational restructure you proposed in January would have saved the company $7 million annually if it had been implemented." Ilara blinked. She'd assumed those proposals had been filed away and forgotten, the way most mid-level executive suggestions disappeared into bureaucratic void. "I read everything that crosses my desk that demonstrates genuine strategic thinking," Roman continued. "Your work stood out. Not because it was polished or politically safe, but because it was right. You have instincts that can't be taught and intelligence that's wasted on operational management." He turned to face her. "I'm creating a new position. Strategic Director of Corporate Intelligence. You'd report directly to me, bypassing traditional hierarchies entirely. Your job would be identifying vulnerabilities, recognizing opportunities, and providing analysis on ventures both legitimate and," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "adjacent to legitimate." The implications settled over her like weight. He wasn't just offering a promotion. He was offering entry into the parts of his empire that existed in shadows, the network everyone whispered about but nobody could prove. "You'd have access to information most executives never see," Roman said. "Resources that don't appear on official budgets. Protection that extends beyond corporate policy. And compensation that reflects the value of your insights and the risks inherent in possessing them." "You're asking me to work for both sides of your organization," Ilara said slowly. "The legitimate business and the... I'm asking you to help me manage an empire that operates in gray areas by necessity but can be directed toward minimizing harm and maximizing strategic advantage." His gaze was steady, unflinching. "The world isn't divided into legal and illegal, Ilara. It's divided into power used responsibly and power used for exploitation. I prefer the former. Your intelligence could ensure that preference becomes consistent practice." Silence stretched between them. Outside, the city pulsed with life, millions of people conducting business, legal and otherwise, navigating systems that rewarded the clever and crushed the vulnerable. "Why me?" she asked. "You have people who've been loyal for years. Why offer this to someone you've known for 2 weeks?" "Because loyalty without competence is useless, and competence without integrity is dangerous." Roman moved closer, stopping at a distance that felt respectful rather than intimidating. "You filed a harassment complaint knowing it could destroy your career. You continued working with cracked ribs rather than show weakness. You built evidence, documented patterns, and fought for what was right even when the system failed you." He held her gaze. "That's not just intelligence, Ilara. That's character. And character is the rarest resource in my world." Ilara accepted the position 3 days later. Not because she needed the money, though the compensation Roman offered was staggering. Not because she felt obligated, though gratitude certainly played a role. She accepted because for the first time in her professional life, someone had recognized her value without requiring her to diminish herself to prove it. The transition happened swiftly. Roman's operations moved with efficiency that suggested they'd perfected the art of restructuring reality. Her old apartment was packed, her belongings relocated to a secure residence in the financial district. Her official title appeared on corporate directories with carefully vague responsibilities that explained everything and nothing. The real work began in Roman's private office on the 43rd floor. He'd converted the adjacent conference room into her workspace, windows facing north, technology that definitely wasn't commercially available, and access to databases that made her previous security clearance look like public library privileges. Within hours of her first day, Ilara understood the scope of what she'd agreed to. DeLuca Enterprises wasn't just a corporation. It was an ecosystem. Legitimate businesses formed the visible canopy, but beneath them operated networks of influence, information brokerage, and strategic manipulation that shaped outcomes across industries. Roman didn't break laws so much as exist in spaces where laws became negotiable, and her job was ensuring those negotiations favored objectives that minimized collateral damage. It was morally complicated, intellectually fascinating, and utterly unlike anything she'd imagined doing with her MBA. "You're smiling," Roman observed during their 3rd week working together. They'd fallen into a rhythm: early morning briefings, independent work during business hours, evening strategy sessions that often stretched past midnight. "I'm realizing I've been bored for years and didn't know it," Ilara admitted. "Corporate management felt like painting by numbers. This feels like chess against opponents who don't know they're playing," Roman finished. "And you're better at it than you realize." The compliment landed differently than praise from previous supervisors. Roman didn't offer empty flattery or manipulative encouragement. When he said something, he meant it, and the weight of his approval carried value because he didn't distribute it carelessly. Something had shifted between them during those late-night strategy sessions. Conversations that started as professional analysis would drift into personal territory, his history building the empire, her childhood in foster care that had taught her to recognize predators and protect herself. Shared understanding of what it meant to survive in worlds that didn't value vulnerability. One evening, reviewing acquisition targets in the dim glow of multiple monitors, Ilara looked up to find Roman watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" she asked. "I'm trying to determine when this stopped being about business," he said quietly. Her breath caught. "Roman, I know the optics are complicated. Your employer, the power imbalance, the circumstances that brought you here." He stood, maintaining that careful distance he'd preserved since the parking garage incident. "But I need you to know that your position, your safety, your future with this organization, none of that is contingent on anything beyond your professional value." "I know. Do you?" Ilara crossed the space between them. Not impulsively. Not recklessly. She moved with the same careful calculation she applied to strategic analysis, weighing risks against rewards, evaluating consequences, making decisions based on complete information rather than partial data. "I know my value to this organization," she said, stopping close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "I know you'd protect my position regardless of what happens or doesn't happen between us. I know that refusing any personal involvement wouldn't cost me professionally. Then you understand why I can't. I also know," she continued, "that you've spent 2 months ensuring I feel safe, valued, and capable. That you restructured your entire company to protect women you'd never met. That you look at me like I'm the most interesting problem you've ever tried to solve, and you're someone who thrives on complicated problems. Roman's jaw tightened. Ilara. I was broken when you caught me. Literally and metaphorically. You could have handled it through corporate channels, maintained professional distance, treated me like a liability to be managed. She held his gaze. Instead, you gave me time, space, resources, and a future that makes me feel powerful rather than victimized. So yes, I understand the complications. I also understand that some things are worth the risk. The silence between them felt charged, heavy with implications and possibilities. I need you to be certain, Roman said quietly. Because once we cross this line, I won't be able to maintain the distance I've kept. I won't be casual about your safety, your well-being, or your future. And that intensity, it's not something everyone wants. I'm not everyone. His smile was slight but genuine. No. You're definitely not. When he kissed her, it was careful, restrained, giving her every opportunity to change her mind. But Ilara had spent months being afraid, being broken, being uncertain about everything. This wasn't uncertainty. This was the clearest decision she'd made since accepting his job offer. What started as careful escalated into desperate. Months of tension, unspoken attraction, and mutual recognition finally given permission to exist. They collapsed onto the leather sofa in his office, strategic plans and acquisition reports scattered like forgotten artifacts of the professional pretense they'd maintained. Later, tangled together as city lights painted patterns across skin, Roman traced the faded bruises on her ribs, barely visible now, just ghosts of violence that no longer defined her. You know people will talk, he murmured against her hair. The boss and his protégé. They'll say you earned your position through methods that have nothing to do with intelligence. Let them talk. Ilara shifted to meet his eyes. I know what I'm worth. So do you. And anyone who questions it can review my quarterly analysis and try to find someone better. His laugh was quiet, affectionate. Absolutely terrifying. I've created a monster. You've created a partner. There's a difference. If this story left you wanting more, drop a comment below telling me what you thought, and don't forget to subscribe because I've got more intense stories coming your way. Thanks for watching.